The Thanksgiving dinner table stretched before me like a battlefield, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier my grandfather had installed 40 years ago. 23 family members chattering away, their voices creating that familiar symphony of judgment and superiority I'd grown to expect at these gatherings. "Sarah's still working at that little coffee shop, aren't you, dear?" Aunt Margaret's voice cut through the noise like a blade wrapped in silk. Her diamond bracelet, the one she'd inherited from Grandma Rose, caught the light as she reached for her wine glass. How quaint. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I nodded quietly, cutting my turkey into smaller pieces to avoid having to respond immediately. 26 years old and still serving lattes to strangers while my cousins discuss their corner offices and luxury vacations. The family disappointment, the one who never quite measured up. "Well, at least she's working," Uncle Richard chimed in, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for consolation prizes. "Some people her age are still living with their parents." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward my younger cousin Danny, who shifted uncomfortably in his designer suit. My mother, Patricia, sighed audibly from across the table. "Sarah's always been practical. She likes simple things." The way she said simple made it sound like a medical condition. Not everyone can be as ambitious as Jessica here. Jessica, my perfect cousin, smiled that practiced smile she'd perfected for client presentations. "Actually, we just closed the Henderson merger. $2.7 million in fees." She paused for effect, letting the number hang in the air like expensive perfume. "The partners are talking about making me senior associate." A chorus of congratulations erupted around the table. Champagne was poured. Jessica's mother, Aunt Carol, practically glowed with pride. I watched it all unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing a play they'd seen performed countless times before. "Sarah could learn something from Jessica's drive," my father added, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Maybe if she'd finished her MBA instead of—" He gestured vaguely in my direction, as if my entire existence was too disappointing to articulate. The MBA. Always came back to that. I'd dropped out 6 months before graduation, a decision that had scandalized the family and cemented my status as the black sheep. They didn't know why I'd left. Didn't care to ask, really. The official story was that I couldn't handle the pressure, couldn't keep up with the rigorous academic demands. "Well," said Grandmother Eleanor from the head of the table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been the family matriarch for 3 decades. "We all have our different paths in life." Even her attempt at diplomacy felt like a gentle pat on the head for the family pet. I excused myself to the kitchen, ostensibly to help with dessert, but really to escape the suffocating cloud of disapproval that seemed to follow me everywhere, in this house. The kitchen had always been my refuge during these gatherings, a place where I could breathe without feeling the weight of their expectations. "Don't let them get to you, honey." My great-aunt Helen appeared beside me, her arthritic hands already reaching for the dessert plates. At 82, she was the only person in the family who'd ever shown me genuine kindness without an accompanying lecture about my life choices. "I'm used to it," I replied, arranging the pumpkin pie slices on Grandmother's best china. "Besides, they're not wrong. Jessica is successful, I'm not." Aunt Helen studied me with those sharp blue eyes that age hadn't dimmed. "Success comes in many forms, dear. Your grandfather understood that." She paused, glancing toward the dining room where the conversation had shifted to vacation homes and investment portfolios. "He always said the family was too focused on showing off their wealth instead of understanding its responsibility." I'd heard stories about my grandfather, Eleanor's late husband, but he died when I was 7. Most of what I remembered were fragments. His gentle hands teaching me to play chess, the way he'd listen when everyone else was talking, and the small notebook he always carried, filled with what looked like important observations. preparing, and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He would have been proud of you, Aunt Helen continued quietly. The work you do at the coffee shop, you know it's more than just serving drinks. She was right, though I'd never told the family the whole truth. The Morning Brew wasn't just any coffee shop. It was located in the heart of the financial district, and over the past 3 years, I'd quietly become a trusted confidant to some of the city's most influential business leaders. CEOs, hedge fund managers, city planners. They all came in for their morning coffee and somehow found themselves sharing their biggest challenges with the quiet barista who remembered their orders and asked thoughtful questions. My MBA training hadn't been wasted. It had simply taken a different form. Instead of sitting in boardrooms, I was gathering intelligence from them. Instead of competing with my classmates for prestigious positions, I was building relationships with people who actually had the power to create those positions. But try explaining that to a family obsessed with titles and traditional markers of success. "Sarah!" My mother's voice rang out from the dining room. "Come help us explain to Cousin Mark why dropping out of business school made sense." I closed my eyes briefly, steeling myself for another round of well-intentioned humiliation. Cousin. Mark was the family golden boy before Jessica claimed the title. Harvard MBA, successful consulting firm, everything my parents had hoped I'd become. "Actually," I heard Mark saying as I returned to the dining room, "the business world is changing. Traditional paths aren't the only way to build wealth anymore. Look at tech entrepreneurs, influencers, people who found alternative routes to success." It was a kind attempt at defense, but it only made things worse. Now they were all looking at me with that particular expression reserved for injured animals, a mixture of pity and uncomfortable sympathy. "Well, Sarah isn't exactly building the next Facebook," Uncle Richard laughed. "Though I'm sure the coffee business has its rewards." More laughter. Jessica's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with the self-importance of someone whose time was always valuable. "Sorry, work emergency. Big client wants to discuss the acquisition timeline." Even on Thanksgiving, she was indispensable. Even on family holidays, she was more important than family time. The comparison was impossible to miss, and certainly wasn't lost on my parents, who exchanged one of their meaningful looks across the table. "I should probably head out soon anyway," I said quietly, finishing the last bite of my pie. "Early shift. Tomorrow? On Black Friday?" Grandmother Eleanor looked genuinely puzzled. Surely a coffee shop doesn't need to be open that early on a holiday weekend. They really had no idea. The Morning Brew would be bustling by 5 a.m. on Black Friday, filled with retail executives coordinating their biggest sales day of the year, financial analysts preparing market reports, and business owners strategizing their fourth-quarter pushes. Some of my most valuable conversations happened on days when the rest of the world was sleeping off their holiday meals. "Time and a half," I said simply, which was true enough, though the overtime pay was hardly my primary motivation. As I gathered my coat and purse, the family's attention had already shifted to more interesting topics. Jessica was explaining her latest case to an audience that hung on every word. Mark was discussing his firm's expansion plans. Even Danny, despite his recent setbacks, was fielding questions about his job search with more interest than anyone had ever shown in my work. I was almost to the door when Aunt Helen appeared beside me again. "Sarah, dear, could you help me with something next week? I've been trying to organize some of your grandfather's old papers, and you always had such a good head for numbers and details." I paused, one hand on the doorknob. "Of course, Aunt Helen. What kind of papers?" "Oh, just old financial documents, investment records, that sort of thing. Your grandfather was quite meticulous about his record-keeping, but it's all rather overwhelming for someone my age." She smiled, but something in her expression seemed almost significant. "Tuesday afternoon work for you?" "I'll make it work," I promised, genuinely curious now. My grandfather had been comfortable, certainly, but the family had always treated his wealth as modest compared to the fortunes some of them had built in their own careers. As I drove home to my small apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that Aunt Helen's request was more important than she'd let on. There had been something in her eyes when she mentioned my grandfather's papers, a weight, a significance that went beyond simple estate organization. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Hope you know we love you, sweetheart. We just want you to reach your potential." I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "I know. Love you too." But as I pulled into my apartment complex, passing the luxury cars in the visitor spaces and the modest vehicles in the resident parking, I wondered what they'd think if they knew that my potential was already being reached in ways they couldn't imagine. If they knew about the networking I'd done, the relationships I'd built, the opportunities I'd quietly created while they were all focused on impressing each other with their traditional success stories. Tuesday couldn't come fast enough. Whatever Aunt Helen had discovered in my grandfather's papers, I had a feeling it was going to change everything. Not just for me, but for the entire family dynamic that had defined my place in their world for far too long. After all, sometimes, the quiet ones are quiet for a reason. Sometimes we're not failing to measure up, we're simply measuring different things. The weekend passed in its usual rhythm. Black Friday brought exactly the crowd I'd expected to the morning brew, and I spent the day serving coffee to retail executives who were simultaneously exhilarated and exhausted by their early sales numbers. One conversation with a major department store CEO led to an invitation to a holiday networking event. Another chat with a venture capitalist resulted in her business card and a suggestion that I might be interested in some alternative investment opportunities. By Sunday evening, I had 3 new contacts in my phone and 2 potential leads on business ventures that had nothing to do with coffee service and everything to do with the connections I'd been quietly cultivating for years. Monday dragged by, with unusual slowness. Every time the bell above the morning brew's door chimed, I found myself looking up hopefully, as if Aunt Helen might walk in with revelations about my grandfather's mysterious papers. Instead, it was the usual parade of caffeine-dependent professionals, each bringing their own stories of corporate intrigue and business challenges. "You seem distracted today," observed Dr. Martinez, one of my regular customers who ran a successful medical practice. "Everything okay?" "Just thinking about family," I replied, preparing her usual oat milk cortado. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who understand us least." She nodded knowingly. "I left corporate medicine to start my own practice. My family thought I was crazy to give up a stable hospital position. Now they act like they always believed in my vision." She paused, accepting her coffee with a smile. Family has a way of rewriting history when it suits them. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day. How many times had I heard similar stories? How many successful people had started with family members who doubted their unconventional choices? The pattern was so common it was almost predictable, yet somehow I'd never applied that perspective to my own situation. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of November day that made the warmth of the coffee shop feel even more welcoming. I arranged my schedule to leave early, asking my manager if I could handle the opening shift instead of my usual afternoon slot. "Hot date?" she teased, knowing full well that my social life was practically non-existent. "Family business," I replied, which was accurate enough. Aunt Helen lived in a modest Victorian house about 20 minutes from the family enclave, where most of my relatives had settled. Her neighborhood had character, tree-lined streets, front porches, the kind of place where people still talk to their neighbors. It was a stark contrast to the gated communities and modern mansions that my cousins preferred. She greeted me at the door with tea and homemade cookies, as if organizing financial papers was a social occasion rather than a chore. "I hope you don't mind the mess," she said, leading me toward her late husband's study. "I've been putting this off for months, but it really needs to be done properly." The study was a warm, book-lined room that felt frozen in time. My grandfather's desk dominated the space, its surface covered with neat stacks of documents. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and a large safe sat partially hidden behind a curtain in the corner. He was quite organized, Aunt Helen continued, but also quite private about his business affairs, even with Eleanor, especially with Eleanor, actually. That surprised me. In family lore, my grandparents' marriage had been presented as a partnership in all things. Grandmother Eleanor still spoke about their shared vision for the family's future. I found the combination to the safe in his desk drawer, Aunt Helen said quietly, pulling out a small piece of paper, along with some very specific instructions about what to do with its contents. My heart began to beat faster. What kind of instructions? Instead of answering directly, she handed me an envelope marked with my name in my grandfather's careful handwriting. The paper was yellowed with age, suggesting it had been written years ago. "He asked me to give this to you when you turned 25, she said softly. "But then you dropped out of business school, and the family was so disappointed. I thought, perhaps you weren't ready yet, but watching you at Thanksgiving, seeing how they treat you." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Your grandfather always said timing was everything in business. I think the timing is right now." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in my grandfather's precise handwriting. "My dear Sarah, if Helen is giving you this letter, it means you have reached an age where family expectations and personal truth are likely at odds." I remember being 26 and feeling like the world was measuring me by standards that had nothing to do with who I really was or what I was truly capable of achieving. The family believes I was a simple man who made modest investments and lived a comfortable but unremarkable life. This suited my purposes perfectly. While they focused on displaying their wealth, I focused on building it quietly, strategically, and with a long-term vision that extended far beyond any of them imagined. By the time you read this, you will have learned that success is not always loud, that wisdom is not always recognized, and that sometimes the most powerful position is the one where others underestimate you completely. In the safe, you will find documentation of assets that I have spent 30 years accumulating and protecting. The total value, as of my last assessment, approaches $2 million. This inheritance comes with two conditions. First, that you use it wisely and with the same discretion I employed in building it, and second, that you understand the responsibility that comes with having resources others lack. I am leaving this, to you specifically, because you are the only one in the family who inherited my ability to see clearly while others focus on appearances. Use this gift well, but use it quietly until the moment is right to reveal your true position. The combination to the safe is your grandmother's birthday, 4/15/38. With love and confidence in your future, Grandfather William. I read the letter twice before the words fully sank in. $2 million, hidden away for decades while the family dismissed my grandfather as comfortably middle class. Left specifically to me, the family disappointment, the one who couldn't even finish business school. "Did you know?" I asked Aunt Helen, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "I suspected he was more successful than he let on, but nothing like this. He was always so careful, so private. Even when we were settling his estate, everything appeared quite ordinary. But then I found that letter last month, along with the safe combination and instructions that I was to wait. Until you were ready." I stood up slowly, walking toward the safe. The combination worked on the first try, and the heavy door swung open to reveal not just documents, but a carefully organized archive of financial records spanning 3 decades. Stock certificates, real estate deeds, investment account statements, trust documents, all organized in labeled folders with my grandfather's characteristic attention to detail. A quick scan of the most recent statements confirmed what his letter had promised. The total value of the assets was just over $2 million. But it wasn't just the money that left me speechless. It was the sophistication of the portfolio, the evidence of strategic thinking and market timing that would have impressed even Jessica's financial planning clients. My grandfather hadn't just been lucky, he'd been brilliant. "There's more," Aunt Helen said softly, pointing to a sealed envelope marked, "For Sarah's eyes only." Inside was a detailed letter explaining each investment, the reasoning behind every financial decision, and most importantly, a complete plan for how to manage and protect the inheritance. My grandfather had thought of everything: tax implications, family dynamics, even specific recommendations for financial advisors who specialized in discrete wealth management. Remember, his final note read, "Power is most effective when others don't realize you have it. Use this gift to build the life you truly want, not the life others expect you to want." As I sat in my grandfather's study, surrounded by evidence of his hidden success and his faith in my potential, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. For years, I'd been playing the role of family disappointment while quietly building my own path. Now I had the resources to accelerate that path in ways I'd never imagined possible. The coffee shop job, the networking, the relationships I'd built. Suddenly, they all looked different. Not like the desperate attempts of someone who couldn't succeed traditionally, but like the strategic groundwork of someone preparing for opportunities that others couldn't even see coming. "What will you do?" Aunt Helen asked, watching me carefully organize the documents back into their folders. I thought about Thanksgiving dinner, about Jessica's self-satisfied smile and my parents' disappointed sighs, about Uncle Richard's condescending jokes and Grandmother Eleanor's polite dismissals, about 3 years of serving coffee to people who never looked past the barista apron to see what I was really doing. "I'm going to be very, very careful," I said finally, "and I'm going to wait for exactly the right moment." After all, my grandfather had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong immediately. Sometimes it's letting them continue to underestimate you until the moment when their surprise becomes your greatest advantage. The game was about to change completely. They just didn't know it yet. The weeks following my discovery passed in a strange duality. By day, I continued my routine at the morning brew, serving cappuccinos and collecting business cards with the same practiced humility I'd perfected over 3 years. By night, I sat in my modest apartment studying my grandfather's investment portfolio with the intensity of a graduate student cramming for finals. His strategies were elegant in their simplicity. While the family had been chasing flashy investments and competing over who could display their wealth most ostentatiously, my grandfather had been quietly accumulating dividend-paying stocks, strategic real estate holdings, and carefully selected municipal bonds. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would attract attention, but everything designed for steady, long-term growth. More importantly, he'd included detailed notes about timing: when to buy, when to sell, when to simply wait and let compound interest work its magic. Reading his observations felt like receiving a masterclass in patience and strategic thinking. "You've been different lately," observed Marcus Chen, one of my regular customers who ran a successful import business. "More focused, if that makes sense." I looked up from preparing his usual black coffee, extra shot. "Just thinking about the future." "Good time for it," he said, accepting his cup. "I'm actually looking for someone to help coordinate my holiday shipments. Pays well, and it's perfect for someone with your organizational skills. Interested?" 6 months ago, I would have jumped at the opportunity. Extra income, a chance to prove myself, validation that my skills were valuable. Now, with my grandfather's inheritance safely transferred to discrete investment accounts, I had the luxury of being selective. "That's really generous of you, Marcus, but I'm pretty committed here for now." He nodded, but I caught something in his expression, a flicker of respect that hadn't been there before. Turning down easy money signaled confidence, suggested that I had other opportunities or resources he wasn't aware of. It was my first taste of how differently people treated you when they sensed you didn't need them desperately. The family Christmas party loomed 3 weeks away, and I found myself looking forward to it with an anticipation that had nothing to do with holiday cheer. My cousin Jessica had been posting regularly on social media about her latest promotion, complete with photos of her new corner office and carefully staged shots of her designer workspace. Meanwhile, I'd been having increasingly interesting conversations with some of the city's most influential business leaders, all of whom continued to see me as nothing more than their friendly neighborhood barista. The cognitive dissonance was almost amusing. Sarah seems to be settling into her lifestyle, my mother had mentioned during our weekly phone call. I suppose some people are just meant for simpler things? I'd hummed noncommittally while reviewing. A text from Rebecca Winters, CEO of a major marketing firm, who'd invited me to a private networking event next month. The invitation had come after several conversations about consumer behavior trends, discussions that had started with casual observations about coffee preferences and evolved into sophisticated analyses of market psychology. Dr. Martinez had been right about family rewriting history. What would my mother say when she learned that my simple lifestyle had been a deliberate choice, not a limitation? 2 days before the Christmas party, I made my first significant investment decision. Marcus had mentioned that his import business was looking for a silent partner, someone willing to provide capital in exchange for profit sharing, no active involvement required. The opportunity aligned perfectly with my grandfather's philosophy: strategic investment in proven businesses with trustworthy leadership. I arranged to meet Marcus at a quiet restaurant downtown, far from the morning brew where our relationship had developed. When I walked in wearing a tailored black dress instead of my usual barista uniform, his double take was almost comical. "I have a proposition for you," I said without preamble, settling into the booth across from him. "You mentioned needing a silent partner. I might be interested in discussing terms." Marcus blinked slowly, clearly trying to reconcile the professional woman across from him with the coffee shop employee he'd known for years. Sarah, the investment threshold is pretty substantial. We're talking about a minimum of $200,000. I pulled out a leather portfolio, one of my first purchases with my inheritance, and slid a cashier's check across the table. "Will this suffice as proof of serious intent?" He stared at the check for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, surprise, and finally, grudging admiration. "Where did you—" "Family money," I said simply, which was technically true. "I've been waiting for the right opportunity to make my first major investment. Your business model is solid, your client base is established, and your growth projections are conservative enough to be believable." What followed was the most exhilarating hour of my adult life. Marcus laid out his expansion plans, his market analysis, his risk assessments. I asked questions that drew on everything I'd learned in business school, combined with insights gleaned from 3 years of listening to successful entrepreneurs discuss their challenges over morning coffee. By the end of our meeting, we'd shaken hands on a partnership that would give me a 20% stake in his business in exchange for the capital injection he needed to expand into 3 new markets. "I have to ask," Marcus said as we prepared to leave, "why the coffee shop? Why not just be an investor?" I smiled, thinking of my grandfather's letters about the power of being underestimated. Sometimes the best position is the one where people don't realize how much you're actually seeing and learning. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. The barista who remembers everyone's order and listens to all their business problems. Exactly. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed an invisible threshold. The woman who'd served Marcus coffee that morning was fundamentally different from the woman who'd just become his business partner. Same person, same capabilities, but now with the resources and confidence to act on opportunities instead of just observing them. The Christmas party arrived with all the pageantry I'd come to expect from family gatherings. This year's venue was Uncle Richard's new estate, a sprawling contemporary mansion that screamed new money in every carefully designed detail. The guest list had expanded beyond immediate family to include spouses, children, and various business associates, essentially anyone Richard wanted to impress with his hospitality and success. I arrived deliberately late, after the initial social sorting had already occurred. Jessica was holding court near the fireplace, describing her latest case to an audience of admirers. My parents were deep in conversation with Aunt Carol about vacation home rental properties. Uncle Richard was playing host with characteristic pomposity, ensuring everyone noticed his wine collection and custom lighting system. "Sarah!" Grandmother Eleanor spotted me from across the room and waved me over with the enthusiasm reserved for obligatory family interactions. "Come meet Richard's business partner, James. He's been telling us about their new development project." James turned out to be a man in his 50s with the kind of aggressive handshake that suggested he viewed every interaction as a potential business opportunity. "And what do you do, Sarah?" "I work in hospitality," I replied smoothly, accepting a glass of wine from a passing server. "Client relations, primarily." It wasn't technically a lie. The morning brew was in the hospitality industry, and I'd certainly developed extensive client relationships. The beauty of the phrasing was that it could mean anything from hotel management to corporate consulting, depending on what the listener wanted to assume. "Hospitality's a tough business," James nodded approvingly. "Takes real people skills to succeed in that field." I was saved from further elaboration by the arrival of my cousin Danny, who looked significantly more confident than he had at Thanksgiving. His job search had apparently been successful. "Sarah, good to see you." Danny's enthusiasm seemed genuine, which was refreshing after months of polite family condescension. "I wanted to thank you for that advice you gave me about networking. I searched my memory for whatever casual comment had apparently made an impression. The thing about listening, more than talking? Exactly. Turns out when you stop trying to impress people and start focusing on understanding what they actually need, opportunities open up." He grinned, looking younger than his 24 years. "Landed a position with a startup that's doing exactly the kind of work I wanted to do." Across the room, I noticed my parents watching our conversation with interest. Danny's success seemed to puzzle them. If their own daughter's advice had been valuable enough to help him, why was she still serving coffee for a living? "Speaking of which," Danny continued, lowering his voice slightly, "my new boss is always talking about this coffee place downtown where all the business leaders hang out. Says it's like an informal networking hub. The Morning Brew, I think. Ever heard of it?" I nearly choked on my wine. I may have heard the name mentioned. He swears the barista there is some kind of business genius, says she remembers everyone's order, knows their industries, asks the kind of questions that make people think differently about their challenges. Danny shook his head in amazement. Apparently, half the major deals in the city get discussed over coffee there. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Here was my cousin, earnestly telling me about my own professional reputation, completely unaware that he was describing me to myself. "Sounds like an interesting place," I managed. "Right? I keep meaning to check it out, but their hours don't really align with my schedule. Maybe someday." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica, who approached with the kind of purposeful stride that indicated she had news to share. "Family announcement time," she declared, raising her voice to capture the room's attention. "I just got confirmation that the Henderson merger is officially complete. Our firm's fee came to $3.2 million, and I've been offered the senior partnership track." The room erupted in congratulations. Champagne appeared as if by magic. Jessica basked in the attention with practiced grace, detailing her career trajectory and future earning potential for anyone willing to listen. I found myself studying the family dynamics with new eyes. The eager attention, the competitive undertones, The way everyone seemed to be calculating their own position relative to Jessica's success. It was like watching a nature documentary about hierarchical social structures, except the animals were wearing designer clothes and discussing real estate. Investments. Sarah's been doing well too, Aunt Helen's voice cut through the celebration. She'd appeared beside me with her characteristic quiet observation skills. Haven't you, dear? All eyes turned to me with the polite interest reserved for participants. In a talent show where the talent level was predetermined to be modest. I could feel the familiar weight of their expectations, that I would share some small accomplishment, something appropriately scaled to my perceived limitations. I've been exploring some new opportunities, I said carefully. Investment-related work, actually. Uncle Richard laughed, not unkindly, but with the casual dismissiveness I'd grown to expect. Investment work? Sarah, you know that's a pretty competitive field. Requires significant capital and experience. I'm aware of the requirements, I replied evenly. Something in my tone must have registered because the room fell slightly quieter. Jessica tilted her head with the kind of interested attention she usually reserved for potential clients. What kind of investments? My father asked, his voice carrying a note of parental concern. I hope you're not getting involved in anything risky. Your mother and I could help you review any proposals before you commit to anything. The assumption that I would need their guidance, that I couldn't possibly navigate financial decisions independently, hung in the air like smoke from Uncle Richard's expensive cigars. 3 months ago, it would have stung. Now, it simply felt like further evidence of how completely they'd misunderstood both my capabilities and my circumstances. That's very thoughtful, I said, but I have it handled. Sarah, my mother's voice, took on that particular tone of gentle correction. Investment work isn't like serving coffee. There are regulations, legal implications, serious financial risks. Maybe we should discuss this privately. The conversation had drawn the attention of James, Uncle Richard's business partner, who was watching with the kind of professional interest that suggested he saw an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. Your family's right to be cautious, he interjected smoothly. The investment world is full of predators looking to take advantage of inexperienced investors. What kind of returns are they promising you? The assumption that I was the target rather than the investor was so automatic, so complete, that I felt something shift inside me. These people didn't just underestimate me. They literally couldn't conceive of me as someone who might have resources or expertise worth respecting. Actually, I said, setting down my wine glass and meeting James's eyes directly, I'm not being promised returns. I'm generating them. The silence that followed was different from the polite quiet that had preceded it. This was the silence of people trying to process information that didn't fit their established categories. I'm sorry? Jessica's voice carried a note of professional curiosity. Are you saying you're working in investment management? I'm saying I'm an investor. I paused, letting the words settle. As of last week, I became a silent partner in a successful import business. The terms were quite favorable. Uncle Richard's laugh was more nervous than dismissive this time. Sarah, honey, that kind of partnership requires serious capital. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars minimum. I'm aware, I replied calmly. The initial investment was $200,000. The silence stretched longer this time. I could see them doing the math, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the woman who could casually mention investing more money than most of them made in several years. Where? My mother began, then stopped, clearly struggling with how to phrase the question politely. Family money, I said, using the same explanation I'd given Marcus. Grandfather's inheritance. Grandmother Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. William's inheritance? But Sarah, dear, that was just his modest savings. Account and some old stocks. Certainly not enough for major business investments. I smiled, thinking of the carefully organized files still hidden in Aunt Helen's house. of the investment portfolio my grandfather had spent 30 years building while everyone assumed he was comfortably, but unremarkably, middle class. Grandfather was more successful than any of us realized, I said quietly. Significantly more successful. The implications hit them in waves. First confusion, then calculation, then a dawning awareness that everything they thought they knew about the family's financial hierarchy might be completely wrong. James cleared his throat, his business instincts obviously recognizing a networking opportunity. What kind of import business, if you don't mind me asking? And just like that, the dynamic shifted. Suddenly I wasn't the family disappointment being gently corrected about financial realities. I was a potential business contact, someone worth understanding and cultivating. The transformation was so immediate, so complete, that it would have been funny if it hadn't been so revealing about everything I'd endured for the past several years. Specialty goods from Asia, I replied, watching as several family members suddenly found our conversation much more interesting. The growth projections are quite promising. As the evening continued, I found myself at the center of increasingly sophisticated business discussions. Uncle Richard wanted to know about international trade regulations. Jessica inquired about partnership structures and profit-sharing agreements. Even my parents seemed to view me with a new kind of cautious respect, as if I'd revealed myself. To be fluent in a foreign language they'd never realized I spoke. By the time I left the party, I had 3 business cards from Richard's associates, an invitation to Jessica's firm's next networking event, and a request from my father to discuss family investment strategies over lunch the following week. The drive home gave me time to process what had just occurred. With a single revelation about my grandfather's inheritance and my first business investment, I'd fundamentally altered my position within the family hierarchy. The same people who'd been offering me career advice and gentle corrections about financial reality just hours earlier were now seeking my input and treating me as a peer. But this was only the beginning. I'd revealed just enough to establish myself as someone worth taking seriously, but not enough to show them the full scope of what I was now capable of achieving. My grandfather had been right about the power of being underestimated. Now I was beginning to understand the equal power of strategic revelation, showing people exactly as much as they needed to see, exactly when they were ready to see it. The real game was just getting started. 6 months after the Christmas party. Revelation. I walked into the annual family reunion with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent half a year systematically rewriting the rules of engagement. The venue was the same country club where my cousins had celebrated their various achievements over the years. But my relationship to the space, and to the people filling it, had fundamentally transformed. Sarah! Jessica approached with the kind of professional warmth she'd perfected for client relationships. I've been meaning to call you about that venture capital contact I mentioned. Did you get a chance to review their portfolio? 6 months ago, Jessica wouldn't have asked for my opinion on anything more complex than coffee preferences. Now she routinely sought my input on investment strategies, having learned that my modest inheritance and simple business partnership had grown into something considerably more substantial. My import business with Marcus had exceeded all projections, generating returns that allowed me to expand into 2 additional partnerships. More importantly, my 3 years of relationship building at the Morning Brew had finally begun paying dividends in ways that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Actually, I said, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server, I've decided to pursue a different opportunity. The conversation paused as family members within earshot turned their attention toward us. Over the past months, my business updates had become must-hear intelligence at family gatherings. I'm opening my own venture capital fund, I continued, calmly. Initial capitalization will be $5 million. The silence that followed was becoming familiar, but it still carried a particular satisfaction. Uncle Richard nearly choked on his drink. My parents exchanged one of their meaningful looks, but this time it carried respect rather than concern. $5 million? Grandmother Eleanor's voice carried a note of genuine amazement. "Sarah, dear, how is that possible?" I smiled, thinking of my grandfather's letters about patience and strategic timing. Grandfather's inheritance was more substantial than anyone realized. Combined with some very successful investments over the past year, I'm now in a position to help other entrepreneurs access the capital they need to grow their businesses. What I didn't mention was that my fund would focus specifically on supporting women and minority entrepreneurs, the same people who often found themselves overlooked by traditional investment firms, just as I had been overlooked by my own family. For years. But that means— Danny started, then stopped, his expression shifting as he processed the implications. "It means I'm no longer working at the Morning Brew," I confirmed, though I'll always be grateful for what that experience taught me about reading people and understanding what drives successful business leaders. The transformation in how they looked at me was complete. The woman they'd dismissed as incapable of finishing business school was now launching her own investment fund. The family disappointment who couldn't land an entry-level position was now in a position to create those positions for others. "I have to ask," my father said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been pride mixed with bewilderment. "When did you know? When did you realize you had these capabilities?" I thought about the question seriously. When had I known? Was it during those early conversations with business leaders over morning coffee? During the MBA classes I'd abandoned? When I realized I was learning more from real-world observation than classroom theory? Or had it been earlier, sitting at my grandfather's feet while he taught me chess and explained that the most powerful pieces were often the ones your opponent didn't notice until it was too late? "I think I always knew," I said finally. But it took time to understand that success doesn't always look like what other people expect it to look like. Jessica raised her glass with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "To Sarah, for proving that the quietest person in the room might just be the most dangerous." As the family toasted my success, I caught Aunt Helen's eye across the room. She was smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had kept an important secret at exactly the right moment. My grandfather's wisdom hadn't just been about building wealth. It had been about understanding that timing, patience, and strategic revelation were more powerful than any amount of immediate gratification. Later, as the evening wound down and family members approached me with business cards and investment opportunities, I realized that the real victory wasn't in proving them wrong about my capabilities. It was in becoming the kind of person who could lift others up the same way my grandfather had lifted me. The inheritance had given me financial resources, but the years of being underestimated had given me something more valuable. The understanding that potential exists in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is create opportunities for people others have written off. My grandfather had been right about the power of patience, about the importance of waiting for the perfect moment to reveal your true position, but he'd also taught me something else. Once you have that power, your responsibility is to use it wisely. As I drove home from the reunion, I thought about the entrepreneurs I would soon be meeting, the businesses I would help launch, the careers I would help create. Some of them would probably be dismissed by their own families, overlooked by traditional investors, underestimated by everyone around them. They would find in me what I had found in my grandfather's letter, someone who understood that success comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful position is the one where others don't realize how much you're actually capable of achieving. The game had changed completely, but more importantly, I was now in a position to change the game for others. After all, the best revenge isn't just proving people wrong about you. It's using your success to prove them wrong about everyone else they've underestimated along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.